know that eerie feeling when you're all alone and something just feels off? Imagine that, but it's your first shift at a supermarket, and by the end of the night, you realize the person you trusted might not have been human at all. Stick around, because this isn't just a scary story. It's something that happened to me, and I still can't fully explain it. Hi, my name is Tyler, and I'm here to tell you about one of the most terrifying nights of my life. It was my first night shift at a local supermarket in Portland, Oregon. I was fresh out of high school, excited to have a job and a little nervous about working alone at night. But I figured, how bad could it be? The shift started pretty normal. The store was quiet, the aisles were spotless, and the only sound came from the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I'd seen the place bustling during the day, but at night, it felt like an entirely different world. Empty parking lot, locked doors, and nothing but silence. About an hour in, a man walked out from one of the back rooms. He was bald, maybe in his 40s, wearing a simple button-up shirt and jeans. He looked at me and said, "You're the new guy, right?" "I'm Greg, the manager." I nodded, trying to make a good impression. "Yeah, first night. Nice to meet you." Greg didn't waste any time. "Great. Here's the deal. We're a bit behind on organizing the stock in the warehouse. Think you can handle that? I'll keep an eye on the front." It sounded reasonable. I wasn't about to argue with my manager on my first day. "Sure thing," I said, grabbing the keys he handed me before heading to the back. The stock room was colder than I expected. The concrete floor and metal shelves stretched out like a maze with boxes stacked high. I started organizing, trying to get into a rhythm. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching. "Hey, Greg," I called out, turning around. But it wasn't Greg. It was a man I'd never seen before, wearing a name tag that read, "Manager, Mark." He looked confused. "Who are you, and why are you back here?" he asked, his tone sharp but not aggressive. "I'm Tyler, the new guy," I stammered. "Greg said to organize the stock while he handled the front." Mark's face twisted into a mix of confusion and concern. "Greg? There's no one named Greg working here. I'm the only manager on duty." For a moment, I thought this was some sort of prank, maybe a test for new employees. But the look in Mark's eyes told me he wasn't joking. My stomach dropped. "That's not possible," I said. "He said he was the manager. He gave me the keys." Mark didn't say anything for a few seconds, then he grabbed my arm gently but firmly. "We need to check the store now." Mark and I stepped out of the stockroom into the main part of the store, and it felt like we'd entered a different place entirely. The silence was overwhelming, like the entire world outside had vanished. The bright overhead lights had dimmed just slightly, but enough to make everything feel wrong. "Where did you see this Greg last?" Mark asked, his voice low. "Right here," I said, pointing toward the checkout area. But the space was empty now. No sign of him, no evidence he'd ever been there. As we moved through the aisles, the air seemed heavier, and every small sound, the creak of the floor, the faint buzz of the lights, made my heart race. We checked the employee break room, the office, and the loading dock, but there was no one there. Then, without warning, the store went pitch black. "Mark!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the sudden darkness. I felt his hand grab my shoulder. "I'm here," he whispered, but there was tension in his voice, like even he wasn't sure what was happening. We stood frozen, unsure of what to do, when faint noises started coming from the back of the store. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving through the aisles. Slow, deliberate footsteps getting closer. "We need to move," Mark said, tugging me toward the front entrance. But just as we started walking, the emergency lights flickered on. The dim red glow cast eerie shadows across the store, and that's when we saw him. Standing near the employee-only door was Greg, or whatever he was. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us. His face was blank, his head tilted slightly, and his hands were gripping something that looked like a wrench. "What the hell is he doing?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know," Mark replied, "but we're not sticking around to find out." We bolted for the front doors, not bothering to check if Greg was following us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The glass doors were locked, just like they were supposed to be during the night shift, and in my panic, I fumbled with the keys. "Hurry up!" Mark hissed, glancing over his shoulder. I looked back too, and my stomach dropped. Greg was walking toward us, not running, just a slow, deliberate walk, but there was something in his eyes that froze me in place. They weren't normal. They looked hollow. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and we both stumbled outside into the cold night air. Mark slammed the door shut behind us and locked it. We ran to the parking lot and called the police, trying to explain what had happened. "Wait here," Mark said. "I'll make sure no one leaves the store." I stayed near the edge of the lot, my hands shaking as I tried to process everything. I couldn't stop thinking about Greg, about those eyes and how calm he seemed despite everything. That's when Mark came running back, his face pale. "He's gone," he said. "I checked the cameras. He's not in the store anymore." "How is that possible?" I asked, but Mark didn't have an answer. The police arrived a few minutes later, but by then, there was no trace of Greg or the wrench. The police combed through the store, checking every inch for signs of Greg, or whatever he was. They found nothing. The cameras hadn't recorded anything unusual, which made no sense. Mark and I had seen him with our own eyes, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. As the officers wrapped up their questions, one of them pulled me aside. "You said his name was Greg?" he asked, flipping through his notebook. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky. "That's what he told me." The officer hesitated for a moment. "We had a report a few years back about a man who matched that description. He used to work here, but..." He trailed off as if deciding how much to tell me. "Let's just say he was let go under suspicious circumstances. He died in a car accident not long after." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But I saw him," I said. "He was here tonight. I'm not making this up." The officer looked at me with a mix of pity and disbelief. "Sometimes people see what they want to see," he said before walking off. Mark drove me home that night. Neither of us said much during the ride. I could tell he was as shaken as I was, but neither of us had answers to the questions swirling in our minds. When he dropped me off, he turned to me and said, "Tyler, you don't have to come back if you don't want to. No one would blame you." And he was right. I didn't go back. Whatever happened that night, whether it was some sort of cruel prank, an actual intruder, or something beyond explanation, I wasn't going to risk being alone in that store again. Even now, years later, I can't explain what I saw. All I know is that the man I met that night wasn't supposed to be there. Was he a ghost, a spirit, or something darker? I don't know. But if you ever find yourself working a night shift in an empty store, remember this. Not everyone you see is who they claim to be. Oh, and if you enjoyed hearing about this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You never know what other chilling stories might come next. They say you never truly know what's hiding in the shadows until you've been alone in the dead of night. I learned that the hard way. By the time I found the makeshift house, hidden in the rafters of the warehouse, the man in black had already vanished. But what he left behind? Well, let's just say it changed the way I look at the dark forever. My name is Daniel, and I work the graveyard shift at a large hardware store in Portland, Oregon. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and the solitude doesn't usually bother me. I stack shelves, organize inventory, and make sure everything's ready for the morning crew. The warehouse, though, cold, cavernous, and eerily quiet, has always given me the creeps. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., grabbed my scanner, and headed to the back. The place was dead silent, except for the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights or the distant clatter of machinery. But as I worked, I heard something strange. A faint but distinct thud echoing from the far end of the warehouse. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. Maybe it was just a pallet settling or something shifting on its own. That's what I told myself anyway. Shaking it off, I got back to work. But not long after, there was another sound, louder this time. It was like something heavy had fallen or been pushed. I decided to check it out. Slowly, I made my way toward the source of the noise. The air seemed colder the closer I got, and the fluorescent lights flickered faintly above me. When I turned the corner, my stomach dropped. There, scattered across the floor, were several boxes that had toppled off a shelf. Seriously? I muttered under my breath, bending down to pick up the mess. It wasn't uncommon for things to fall if they hadn't been stacked properly, but something about this didn't feel right. The boxes had been stacked securely earlier, I was sure of it. As I restacked them, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the aisle was empty. Still, that uneasy sensation stayed with me. I was about to head back to my workstation when I heard another noise, a faint rustling coming from the next aisle. It was subtle, like fabric brushing against a surface. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the vast space. No response. Slowly, I stepped around the corner. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a shadow moving at the far end of the aisle. It was quick, just a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Someone, or something, was definitely in the warehouse with me. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow was gone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone was here, and they weren't supposed to be. My first thought was to grab my phone and call someone, anyone, but my curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. Each step echoed faintly in the empty warehouse, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The aisles stretched endlessly, towering shelves filled with everything from plumbing supplies to heavy-duty tools. It was easy to get lost back there, and that thought sent a chill down my spine. I reached the end of the aisle where I'd seen the shadow. There was nothing but neatly stacked boxes and a faint smell of sawdust in the air. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something unusual. A trail of scuff marks on the floor, like someone had dragged something heavy through the area. I followed the marks, my breath hitching with each step. They led me to a narrow passageway between two rows of shelves. At the far end stood a figure, a man dressed entirely in black. He was tall, with his hood pulled up, obscuring his face. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us heavy with tension. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound authoritative. "You're not supposed to be here. This is private property." Without a word, the man turned and bolted down the aisle. Panic surged through me as I took off after him, my boots thudding against the concrete floor. He was fast, weaving effortlessly between the shelves and disappearing into the maze-like expanse of the warehouse. I lost sight of him after a few minutes, and frustration bubbled up inside me. "What the hell is going on here?" I muttered to myself, leaning against a shelf to catch my breath. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? How did he get in? And why was he here? Before I could gather my thoughts, I noticed something else. Near where the man had been standing, there were more scuff marks, along with a few discarded items, a crumpled food wrapper, an empty water bottle, and a torn piece of fabric. It was as if he'd been living here. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I kept searching. I combed through aisle after aisle, scanning for any sign of the man. The warehouse felt different now, less like a workplace and more like a labyrinth filled with secrets. My flashlight cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, and every creak or rustle made me jump. Then I saw it, a stack of boxes piled unusually high in one corner of the warehouse. Something about the arrangement caught my attention. It looked deliberate, almost like a barrier. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight over the stack. That's when I noticed a makeshift ladder built from wooden pallets leading to the top. Climbing up, I felt my pulse quicken. At the top, hidden behind the boxes, was a small shelter. It was crude but functional, with a blanket spread out on the floor, a small camping stove, and a collection of stolen goods from the store. There were cans of food, tools, and even a flashlight that looked eerily similar to mine. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The man had been living here right under our noses. For how long, I couldn't say, but judging by the setup, it had been a while. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just trespassing. It was something far more unsettling. I took out my phone to document what I'd found. As I recorded the scene, a nervous laugh escaped me. This is insane. If you're watching this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. With that, I climbed back down and called the police. My hands trembled as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. They assured me someone would be there soon, but those minutes waiting felt like hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still nearby, watching me from the shadows. When the police finally arrived, I led them to the shelter. But of course, the man was gone. All that remained were his belongings, a haunting reminder of how close he had been. One of the officers turned to me, a grim expression on his face. "You're lucky you didn't corner him," he said. "People like this, they're unpredictable." The shelter was empty, but the sense of unease lingered. The officers combed through the area, searching for any sign of where the man might have gone. They found a few additional items tucked away: a tattered notebook filled with incoherent scrawls, a rusted pocket knife, and an old key with no obvious use. But the man himself had vanished, leaving nothing but questions in his wake. As I stood there watching the police bag the evidence, a chilling thought crossed my mind. How many nights had I worked here, oblivious to his presence? How often had I unknowingly passed him in the dark? The lead officer approached me, pulling me from my thoughts. "We'll run prints and check surveillance," he said, though his tone didn't inspire much confidence. "But if he's been here this long without anyone noticing, he knows how to cover his tracks." I nodded, my mouth dry. The officers eventually packed up and left, but not before warning me to stay vigilant. "If you see or hear anything unusual, call us right away," one of them said. Easier said than done. At that point, everything felt unusual. The rest of my shift was a blur. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of the lights made my heart race. By the time the morning crew arrived, I was exhausted physically and mentally. I tried explaining what had happened, but most of them just laughed it off. "Probably some homeless guy looking for shelter," one coworker said dismissively. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The man hadn't just been hiding, he'd been watching, learning. The thought made my skin crawl. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed every detail: the shadow, the scuff marks, the hidden shelter. And then there was that notebook. What had he been writing? Was it random gibberish or something more sinister? A few days later, the store manager called to tell me the police hadn't found anything useful. The prints were smudged, the key didn't match any known locks, and the surveillance footage from the warehouse was mysteriously corrupted. It was as if the man in black had never existed. But I know what I saw. And every time I step into that warehouse, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there watching me from the shadows. They say the dark hides many things. Now, I believe it. And if you've ever felt that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense that someone is watching you when you're all alone, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, the shadows are alive. You know that feeling when the air turns cold, not just physically, but in a way that makes your skin crawl like you're not alone? That's how I felt the night I saw it. By the time the lights flickered back on, I knew one thing. I wasn't imagining it. Hi, my name is Ethan, and I work the graveyard shift at a small grocery store in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Or at least I used to. I'll tell you right now, what happened to me during one of my shifts changed everything. You see, working night shifts isn't glamorous. Most of the time it's just me, the fluorescent lights, and the dull hum of the freezers. To pass the time and avoid my supervisor's endless micromanaging, I'd often sneak into the dairy cooler. It was my secret hideaway, a place where the cold felt oddly comforting, like a personal fortress away from the world. That night started like any other. I was halfway through my shift, pacing the empty aisles and listening to the faint buzz of the overhead speakers playing some outdated pop hits. The store was dead silent, as it usually was after midnight. No customers, No distractions, just the eerie stillness that made every creak and shuffle sound amplified. I grabbed a crate of milk cartons and slipped into the cooler, shutting the door behind me. The glass pane fogged up instantly, blurring the view of the store outside. I leaned back against the wall, breathing in the icy air, when something caught my attention. A shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe my supervisor walking by or some reflection bouncing off the glass. But when I moved closer to the door, the shadow shifted too. I pressed my face to the fogged-up glass, trying to make out the shape on the other side. It was tall, motionless, and positioned just far enough back that I couldn't make out any features. "Hello?" I called out, my voice muffled by the thick door. No answer. I stood there for a moment, frozen, not from the cold, but from the growing unease creeping up my spine. I told myself it had to be Max, my supervisor, messing with me. He was the kind of guy who thought pranks like this were hilarious. But then I realized something. Max's shift had ended hours ago. I was completely alone in the store. I stepped back from the door, my eyes fixed on the shadow. It didn't move. For a moment, I thought about just staying in the cooler until my shift was over. But something about the silence outside felt wrong. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the entire store went dark. I swallowed hard, clutching the crate of milk as if it could somehow protect me. I fumbled for my phone, using the faint glow of its screen to guide me back to the door. But when I reached for the handle, I froze. The shadow was gone. When the lights went out, the silence in the store became deafening. It was like the hum of the freezers and the faint overhead music had been swallowed whole. All I could hear was my own breathing, sharp and uneven, as I stood in the icy embrace of the cooler. My phone's glow barely illuminated the small space around me. I hesitated to open the door. What if something was waiting for me out there? But staying inside didn't feel any safer. The thought of being trapped in the dark, surrounded by the thick glass and the faint smell of dairy, felt suffocating. I pressed my phone against the door, using its light to peer through the glass. The store was pitch black, except for the faint emergency exit signs casting an eerie green glow. I squinted, trying to make out anything in the darkness, but the shelves and aisles just looked like towering, shadowy shapes. Then I saw it. It was faint at first, just a blur of movement at the far end of the store. My heart raced as I watched a figure emerge, tall and impossibly still. It stood at the edge of the green light, right where the shadows seemed to swallow everything whole. I blinked, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't disappear. It was there, unmoving, blocking the faint glow of the emergency light like a solid shadow. I clenched my jaw and stepped back from the door. My hand shook as I tried to unlock the phone, half considering calling someone, anyone, to talk me through this. But who would believe me? "Hey, I think I'm being stalked by a shadow in the grocery store." Yeah, that wouldn't exactly go over well. The figure took a step forward. The sound it made was the worst part. A low scrape, like nails dragging across the tile floor. I stumbled back, bumping into the shelves behind me. The milk cartons rattled and a bottle of cream fell to the floor, spilling its contents in a pool at my feet. I don't know what I was thinking when I reached for the door. Maybe it was instinct or pure panic, but I pushed it open and stepped out into the cold, dark store. The air outside the cooler wasn't any warmer. If anything, it felt colder, like the chill had spread out from the cooler and taken over the entire store. My shoes squeaked on the tile floor as I moved cautiously toward the emergency exit sign. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the empty aisles. No response. The figure was gone. I let out a shaky breath and tried to steady my nerves. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light. Or maybe I was so tired that my brain was playing games with me. Either way, I just wanted to finish my shift and get the hell out of there. As I turned toward the stockroom, the lights flickered again, just enough to cast jagged shadows across the walls. My heart leaped into my throat when I saw it, standing at the end of the dairy aisle. The figure. It was closer now, and I could see its outline more clearly. It was tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the ground. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if it were watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare. Then it took another step forward. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance as I turned and bolted toward the front of the store. My footsteps echoed loudly, a frantic rhythm against the silence. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me mid-sprint. I yanked it out, hoping against hope that it was some kind of distraction, maybe a text or a random notification to ground me back in reality. Instead, it was a recommendation. If you're enjoying this story, why not subscribe and hit the like button? You won't want to miss what happens next. I laughed nervously, the absurdity of the moment not lost on me. But before I could process it, I felt a cold gust of air at my back. I whipped around, my phone trembling in my hand. The figure was there again, impossibly close now. Its shadow seemed to stretch and bend around the aisles, swallowing the light. And then it moved. Not like a person, no shuffle of feet or sway of arms. It was sudden, like it had skipped across the space between us. One moment it was at the end of the aisle, and the next it was right in front of me. I screamed, the sound ripping out of me before I could stop it. My scream echoed through the empty store, but the figure didn't flinch. It loomed over me, towering, its presence suffocating. My legs trembled as I staggered backward, colliding with a shelf. Boxes of cereal tumbled to the floor, the crash breaking the heavy silence. The sound seemed to snap me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, my breath ragged and my heart pounding against my ribs. My phone's weak light was barely enough to guide me, but I didn't care where I was going, only that I had to get away. As I rounded the corner into the frozen foods aisle, the store lights flickered back on. For a brief, blinding moment, everything looked normal again. The rows of products, the clean white tiles, it was just the same old grocery store. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. My legs almost gave out from the relief, but I forced myself to keep moving. I wasn't about to stick around to see if it came back. I bolted for the front doors, my shoes squeaking loudly on the polished floor. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The store's automatic doors were wide open, letting in the cool night air, but no one was outside. Not a single car in the parking lot. I had parked my car right near the entrance, but now it was gone. I froze, my mind racing. Did someone move it? Did I just forget where I parked? No, I knew exactly where I had left it. The doors suddenly slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There it was again. The figure was standing at the far end of the aisle, still as a statue, its head tilted to the side, as though it were studying me. This time I didn't wait. I charged at the doors, slamming my hands against the glass. They didn't budge. "Open!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I turned back to look at the figure. It was closer now, the lights above it flickering in rapid bursts. The lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness once more. My breath came in short gasps as I clawed at the doors, desperate to escape. Then I heard it. A sound like heavy, deliberate footsteps. They echoed through the empty aisles, slow and methodical, each one louder than the last. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, no." I grabbed my phone, fumbling with it as I tried to turn on the flashlight. The faint beam cut through the darkness, shaking wildly as my hand trembled. I aimed it toward the aisles, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I saw nothing but the neat rows of shelves. Then, the beam caught something at the edge of the frozen section. The figure was there, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its body seemed to shimmer as if it weren't fully solid. "Stay away," I yelled, my voice cracking. It didn't listen. The footsteps grew louder, echoing around me. The figure didn't move, but the sound closed in, circling me like a predator toying with its prey. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching my phone like a lifeline. "This isn't real. This isn't real," I repeated to myself, hoping the words would somehow make it true. Then silence. I opened my eyes. The lights flickered back on, flooding the store with their harsh fluorescent glow. The figure was gone. I stumbled backward, my legs barely holding me up. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. For a long moment, I just stood there, shaking and gasping for air. When I finally found the strength to move, I didn't look back. I grabbed my jacket from the break room and bolted for the emergency exit. The alarm blared as I pushed through the door, but I didn't care. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a wave. I collapsed onto the pavement, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I never went back to that store. I didn't tell my manager why I quit, and I never explained to anyone what happened that night. Honestly, I'm not sure they would have believed me. But I'll tell you this. If you ever find yourself alone in a grocery store after midnight, stay out of the cooler. You never know what might be waiting on the other side of the glass.